July 1944, Central Germany. Hamann Hans Vera Lecce walked toward Hangar 7 with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. In front of him, under the light filtering through bomb-damaged skylights, sat an aircraft he had never seen before. An American Vault F4U Corsair with its distinctive inverted gull wings and long nose that made it look like a predator ready to pounce. The Corsair had arrived at Lien 3 weeks earlier, transported by ship from Norway after an emergency landing tail, number JT404, Royal Navy. Lurch had tested dozens of captured Allied aircraft, Spitfires, P-47 Thunderbolts, the Whistling Death reputation, and Luftwaffe's need for answers, even a B-7. But this one was different. The Corsair had a legendary reputation in the Pacific. The Japanese called it Whistling Death for the distinctive sound of its engine in a dive. Luftwaffe command wanted answers. Could the Corsair compete with the FW-190 and BF-109? What were its weaknesses? And most importantly, what made this aircraft so lethal? July 18, 1944. How the Corsair JT404 Royal Navy was captured in Norway sky over occupied Norway near the port city of Bodø. Lieutenant Matali of the Royal Navy was piloting his Corsair JT404 on a reconnaissance mission. When the engine began losing power, fuel system problem, Matali had two options: attempt to reach the carrier HMS Formidable in the Norwegian Sea, or look for an emergency landing. He chose the second. Too risky to attempt a water landing in rough seas, he spotted an open field near Bodø and brought the Corsair down. Hard landing, but controlled. The aircraft was intact. Matali destroyed the radio and attempted to set fire to the cockpit, but German troops arrived before he could complete the destruction. For the Germans, it was an incredible stroke of luck. The Corsair was practically intact, only minor damage to the landing gear and fuel system repayable. And most importantly, it was an F4U-1A, the latest version with the raised cockpit that improved pilot visibility. The transport, 18 days by sea and rail. The local Wehrmacht command immediately contacted Berlin. The order was clear: transport the aircraft to Germany as quickly as possible. The problem? The Corsair couldn't fly. The fuel system damage required spare parts the Germans didn't have, and disassembling the aircraft for ground transport would take weeks. The solution was bold: loaded onto a ship from Narvik and transported by sea to a German port, then by rail to Reclan. It took 18 days. The Corsair arrived at Reclan on August 5th, covered in salt spray and with additional minor corrosion damage. But it was there, and it was flyable once the fuel system was giving orders. The evaluation. The task falls to Lischer, repaired. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring personally ordered the evaluation. The Luftwaffe was losing air superiority over Europe. American fighters, P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, were decimating German formations. If the Corsair was coming to the European theater, the Luftwaffe needed to know how to fight it. The task fell to Lisch. At 27 years old, he was already one of the most experienced test pilots at Reclan. He had flown over 60 different aircraft types, including 25 captured Allied planes. His reports were precise, technical, brutally honest. But the Corsair presented a unique challenge. Unlike the P-47 or Spitfire, which German pilots had encountered in combat and could describe, the Corsair was a mystery. No Luftwaffe pilot had faced one over Europe. All intelligence came from Japanese reports in the Pacific, reports that described the Corsair as nearly invincible in the hands of a skilled pilot. Lurcher spent 2 days ground assessment, engineering and firepower, studying the aircraft on the ground. The engineering was impressive. The inverted gull-wing design allowed for a shorter, stronger landing gear while maintaining propeller clearance. The cockpit, raised in the F4U version, offered better forward visibility than earlier models. The 650 caliber machine guns in the wings carried 400 rounds per gun, devastating firepower. But numbers on paper meant nothing. Lurcher needed to fly it. The Corsair test was scheduled. The test flight begins. Cockpit and the R2800 engine for August 8, 1944. Clear skies, light winds, perfect conditions. Lurch arrived at Hangar 7 at 0600 hours. The ground crew had completed the pre-flight checks, fuel tanks full. All systems operational. Lurcher climbed into the cockpit. Immediately, he noticed differences from German fighters. The seat position was higher, giving excellent visibility over the long nose. The control stick was centered between his legs, not offset like in the BF-19. The instrument panel was logically organized, easy to read. He started the engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp roared to life. 2,000 horsepower, twice the power of a BF-109G's Daimler-Benz engine. The entire aircraft vibrated with raw power. Lurcher taxied to the runway. The Corsair's long nose completely blocked forward visibility on the ground. He had to weave side to side to see ahead, a technique he had learned from captured American pilot interrogations. At the runway threshold, he pushed the throttle forward. The acceleration was brutal. The Corsair leaped forward, tail up almost immediately. At 80 knots, Lurch pulled back on the stick. The Corsair climbed like nothing he had ever flown. Lurch leveled off at 3,000 meters, and basic handling and speed advantage, 420 plus knots, began his evaluation protocol. First, basic handling characteristics. He banked left, then right. The Corsair responded smoothly, but with noticeable heaviness at low speed. The ailerons required more force than a FW-190. This matched Japanese reports. The Corsair was not a dogfighter at low speeds. Second, acceleration will push the throttle to full power and watch the airspeed indicator climb. 300 knots, 350 knots, 400 knots. The Corsair kept accelerating with no sign of strain. At 420 knots, nearly 485 miles per hour, Lush pulled back the throttle. The FW-190A-88, Germany's frontline fighter, topped out at 408 miles per hour. The speed advantage alone was significant, but it was the third test that revealed the Corsair's true nature. Lurch climbed to 6,000 meters, 20,000 feet, and began a series of vertical combat, and energy fighting maneuvers. First, a simple zoom climb performance, 8,200 meters on momentum. Alone, full throttle, pull up sharply, see how high the aircraft could climb on momentum alone. The Corsair shot upward like a rocket. Lurch watched the altimeter spin 6,500 meters, 7,000 meters, 7,500 meters. The aircraft was still climbing when it finally stalled at 8,200 meters, a 1,200 meter gain on pure energy. He tried it again, this time from a dive rolled inverted, pulled through into a steep dive, accelerated to 450 knots, then pulled hard into a vertical climb. The G-forces crushed him into the seat. The Corsair's airframe groaned, but held. The altimeter spun wildly, 8,000 meters, 8,500 meters, 9,000 meters. Lurch held the climb until the aircraft stalled at 10,400 meters, over 34,000 feet. This was the revelation. The Corsair wasn't designed for turning dogfights like a Spitfire or BF-109. It was designed for vertical combat, boom and zoom tactics. Dive on the enemy from above. Use superior speed and power to climb back to altitude. Repeat. The massive R2800 engine gave it energy advantages no German fighter could match. Lurcher, simulated attack Corsair, regains altitude 40% faster than FW190, tested the theory. He set up a simulated attack run, dive from 7,000 meters to 4,000 meters at maximum speed, pull out, then execute a maximum performance climb back to 7,000 meters. The dive was terrifying. The Corsair accelerated past 500 knots, over 575 miles per hour. The airframe shuddered but remained stable. At 4,000 meters, Lurch pulled back hard on the stick. The G-forces were crushing. He estimated 6 Gs, maybe more. His vision tunneled, but the Corsair pulled through cleanly. Then the climb, full throttle, optimal climb speed. The aircraft rocketed upward. Lurcher checked his stopwatch. 2 minutes 40 seconds to regain 3,000 meters of altitude. He had flown the FW190A-8 through the same maneuver 2 months earlier, time to climb 4 minutes 15 seconds. The Corsair was 40% faster. Tactical implications. The paradox for German pilots. Lurch's mind raced through the tactical implications. If American pilots used these tactics over Europe, and they would because it was the only logical way to exploit the Corsair's strengths, German fighters would be at a catastrophic disadvantage. The Bf-109 and FW-190 were designed for horizontal turning combat. They could out-turn a Corsair at low to medium speeds. But if the Corsair never committed to a turning fight, if it stayed fast and used vertical maneuvers, German pilots would be chasing an opponent they could never catch. Lurch tested the gun platform stability, accurate fire with 6.50 cals, stability. He rolled into a 30-degree dive, lined up on a ground reference point, and squeezed the trigger. The 650 caliber machine guns erupted. The recoil was surprisingly mild. The Corsair's heavy airframe absorbed it easily. The gun sight remained steady. Lurch could keep the target centered even while firing full bursts. He compared it mentally to the FW190S armament. The A8 carried two 13mm machine guns and four 20mm cannons. Devastating firepower, but the recoil made accurate shooting difficult. Especially in high-speed attacks, the Corsair's 650 calories delivered less punch per round, but the stability meant more rounds on target. After 35 minutes of flight, Lers had his preliminary assessment. But there was one more test he needed to run. The test, the most dangerous capability, energy retention and quick escape, that would reveal the Corsair's most dangerous capability. Lers climbed back to 7,000 meters and set up for a simulated combat scenario. A Corsair diving on a German formation from above. The German fighters see the attack and brake. Standard defensive maneuver. The Corsair overshoots, but instead of trying to turn with the German fighters, it uses its speed to extend away and climb back to altitude. Question: how long would it take a FW190 to climb back to the Corsair's altitude and re-engage? Lurch rolled inverted and pulled into a steep dive, simulating the Corsair's attack run. He let the speed build to 480 knots, then pulled out hard at 4,000 meters. The G-forces slammed him into the seat, his vision grayed at the edges. The Corsair groaned but held together. At the bottom of the pullout, Lurch immediately transitioned into a maximum performance climb. Full throttle, optimal climb speed of 130 knots indicated airspeed. The R-280 engine roared. The Corsair clawed for altitude. He started his stopwatch. At 5,000 meters, 1 minute 15 seconds elapsed. At 6,000 meters, 2 minutes 20 seconds elapsed. At 7,000 meters, 3 minutes 35 seconds elapsed. Lurch leveled off and checked his fuel. Still adequate. He noted the time in his kneeboard, then ran the numbers in his head. He had flown the same profile in a FW190A88. The staggering difference: 2 minutes 15 seconds. Head start 2 months earlier. Time to climb from 4,000 to 7,000 meters, 5 minutes 50 seconds. The difference was staggering. The Corsair could execute a boom and zoom attack, extend away, and be back at fighting altitude a full 2 minutes and 15 seconds before pursuing FW190. 2 minutes and 15 seconds. In air combat, that was an eternity. But the implications went deeper. Lurch realized that the Corsair's energy advantage created a tactical paradox for German pilots. If you dove after a Corsair to pursue, you burned energy trying to catch an aircraft that was faster than you. By the time you gave up the chase, you were low on altitude and energy vulnerable. If you didn't pursue, the Corsair simply climbed back to altitude unmolested and set up another attack. You couldn't ignore it. Either way, the German pilot Lost Lurcher had seen this pattern before in combat reports from the Eastern Front. Soviet pilots flying American Lendl P-39 era Cobras used similar tactics against Bf-109s, but the P-39's performance advantage was marginal. The Corsair's advantage was overwhelming. He ran one defensive scenario: acceleration for separation. More test, simulated defensive scenario. A Corsair is bounced from above by a FW190. The Corsair pilot sees the attack and reacts. What are his options? Lear rolled into a hard defensive break. Maximum G turned to force an overshoot. The Corsair's heavy controls fought him. The turn rate was mediocre compared to a FW190. If this were a real engagement, the German pilot would have a firing solution within seconds. But then, Lurch did what an experienced Corsair pilot would do. He rolled wings level, pushed the throttle to the firewall, and accelerated away in a shallow dive. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly. 300 knots, 350 knots, 400 knots. At 420 knots, Lurch pulled into a climbing turn. Not tight, but fast and energy conserving. He checked his watch. 15 seconds from the initial break to complete separation from the theoretical attacker. A FW190 pilot would have perhaps 3 to 4 seconds of firing opportunity before the Corsair was out of range and climbing away. And if the German pilot tried to follow into the climb, the Corsair would outclimb him and reverse the engagement. Lurch understood now why the Japanese called it whistling death. It wasn't just the sound, it was the inevitability. A well-flown Corsair was nearly impossible to kill because it never had to fight on your terms. But no aircraft, probing weaknesses, low speed, stall, and dive limits was perfect. Lurcher spent the next 10 minutes probing for weaknesses. He tested slow speed handling. Below 150 knots, the Corsair became sluggish. The heavy ailerons required significant force to roll. In a slow-speed scissors maneuver, a common dogfighting situation, AEFW-190 or BF-109 would have a decisive advantage. The problem was getting the Corsair into that situation. A disciplined pilot would never let it happen. Lurch tested the stall characteristics. He pulled the nose up, bleeding off speed, waiting for the brake. At 85 knots, the left wing dropped sharply, a vicious stall with little warning. The Corsair's snap rolled inverted before Lush could react. He recovered easily, But the lesson was clear. Don't slow down in combat. He tested visibility. The raised cockpit of the F4U-1A was a significant improvement over earlier models, but the long nose still created a massive blind spot directly ahead and below. In a turning fight, a German pilot could exploit this, slide into the blind spot, and stay there. Again, the problem was forcing the engagement. If the Corsair never committed to a turn, the blind spot didn't matter. Lurch tested the dive. He pushed the nose over and let the speed build. 450 knots, 480 knots, dive. He pushed the nose over and let the speed build. 450 knots, 480 knots, 500 knots. At 520 knots, over 600 miles per hour, the controls became extremely heavy. The aircraft wanted to continue diving. Pulling out required both hands on the stick and significant effort. This was a real limitation. In a high-speed dive, the Corsair pilot had to plan his pull-out carefully. If he misjudged and dove too fast, he might not be able to pull out at all, or he'd pull so hard he'd black out from G-forces. But even this weakness was marginal. The FW-190 had similar dive limitations, and the Corsair's superior power meant it could afford to dive less steeply and still maintain a speed advantage. After 45, the assessment, Corsair superior in energy fighting minutes of flight. Lurch had his assessment. He throttled back and began his descent back to Rechlin as he flew the landing pattern, weaving side to side to see past the long nose. Lurch mentally composed his report, the devastating conclusions. 14-page report conclusions were clear, and they were devastating. Lurch landed at 0745 hours. The ground crew swarmed the Corsair, checking for any damage from the test flight. There was none. The aircraft was as solid as it looked. Lurch walked directly to the technical office and began writing his report. He worked for 3 hours, straight documenting every observation, every measurement, every tactical implication. The report was 14 pages long. The conclusions were blunt. The Vault F4U Corsair represents a fundamental shift in fighter design philosophy. It is not optimized for traditional turning combat. Instead, it exploits superior power, speed, and energy retention to dictate engagement terms. Against this aircraft, conventional German fighter tactics are inadequate. Lurch detailed the performance data. Maximum speed 420 plus knots at sea level, 485 plus miles per hour, 15% faster than FW 190A88. Climb rate 40% superior to FW 190A88 in combat climb profile. Energy retention, exceptional. Can execute multiple boom and zoom attacks without significant altitude loss. Armament 650 caliber machine guns. Stable platform, adequate firepower. Weaknesses, poor low-speed maneuverability, heavy controls, vicious stall characteristics, limited forward visibility. Then came the tactical assessment, the section that would cause the most controversy. Recommended defensive tactics against F4U Corsair. Avoid engagement if possible. The Corsair's energy advantages make it extremely difficult to defeat in combat. If engagement is unavoidable, force slow-speed maneuvering combat. This is the only regime where German fighters have an advantage. Never pursue a Corsair in a climb or dive. You will lose energy and become vulnerable. Exploit the Corsair's forward visibility limitations in turning combat, but only if the Corsair pilot commits to the turn. Attack only when holding significant altitude advantage, 1,500 plus meters. Even then, expect the Corsair to escape if the pilot is competent. Primary conclusion: the F4U Corsair is superior to all current German fighter aircraft in the energy fighting regime. if deployed to the European theater in Luftwaffe command. The report is classified and buried significant numbers. It will pose a severe threat to Luftwaffe operations. Lurch signed the report and submitted it through channels. He knew what would happen next. The report would go to the Technicians AMP Technical Office, then to the General Stab General Staff, and eventually to Göring himself, and Göring would be furious. 3 days later was summoned to Berlin. The meeting was tense. A General Stab officer, Lurch never learned his name, questioned every conclusion in the report. Was Lurch certain about the performance data? Had he considered that the captured Corsair might have been modified? Was he aware that his assessment contradicted intelligence reports from the Pacific? Lurch stood by his findings. The data was accurate. The Corsair was exactly as capable as his report indicated, perhaps more so since he had only 45 minutes of flight time to explore its full envelope. The officer's response was chilling. Your technical observations are noted. However, the tactical conclusions are premature. The Corsair is a naval aircraft. It will not be deployed to the European theater in significant numbers. Your report will be classified and distributed on a need-to-know basis. Only Lurch understood. The report was being buried, not because it was wrong, but because it was too honest. He returned to Rechlin and continued his work over the next 6 months. He would test 14 more captured Allied aircraft. Each report documented the same uncomfortable truth. Germany was losing the technological war, but unofficial circulation and the irony of the discovery. The Corsair report had a strange afterlife. Copies circulated among Luftwaffe fighter units through unofficial channels, pilots sharing information that official command wouldn't provide. By late 1944, German pilots who had never seen a Corsair knew its capabilities and weaknesses. It didn't matter. The Corsair never came to Europe in large numbers. It remained primarily a Pacific theater aircraft, where it dominated Japanese fighters exactly as Lurch had predicted. The irony wasn't lost on Lurch. He had discovered the truth about one of the war's most lethal fighters, but the discovery changed nothing. Hans Werner Lurcher survived the war. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed on Rechlin, he fled west and surrendered to American post-war legacy, Leischer's memoirs, and the 11-to-1 kill ratio forces. His expertise was immediately recognized. The U.S. Army Air Forces recruited him to test captured German aircraft, the reverse of his wartime role. After the war, Luhr wrote extensively about his experiences. His memoir Luftwaffe Test Pilot, published in 1956, included detailed accounts of testing Allied aircraft, including the Corsair. The book became a primary source for aviation historians studying comparative aircraft performance in World War II. Lurcher remained fascinated by the Corsair throughout his life. In interviews decades later, he called it the most impressive fighter I ever flew, and I flew over 60 types. He particularly admired the engineering philosophy design an aircraft around a specific tactical doctrine, then execute that doctrine ruthlessly. The Corsair's combat record validated Lurch's 1944 assessment. In the Pacific, it achieved an 11-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese fighters. Marine and Navy pilots who flew it called it the best fighter of the war. The Whistling Death lived up to its reputation, but Lurch's report the deeper failure. Suppressing uncomfortable truths raised a deeper question about military intelligence and institutional honesty. He had provided accurate, actionable intelligence about a potential threat. The Luftwaffe command chose to suppress it rather than confront uncomfortable truths about German technological inferiority. This pattern repeated throughout the German military in 1944 to 1945. Officers who reported honestly about Allied capabilities, were accused of defeatism. Intelligence that contradicted official narratives was buried. The result was strategic paralysis. Commanders making decisions based on wishful thinking rather than reality. Lurch's Corsair test was a microcosm of this failure. One test pilot, 45 minutes of flight time, and a 14-page report that told the truth, and the truth was ignored. The lesson extends beyond World War II. In any organization, military, corporate, governmental, the willingness to hear uncomfortable truths is the difference between adaptation and collapse. Lurch provided the truth. The Luftwaffe chose collapse. Hans Werner Lecce died in 1993 at age 75. His legacy is the honest assessment of over 60 aircraft types, including some of the most advanced fighters of World War II. He flew the Corsair once for 45 minutes in August 1944. It was enough to understand